Thank you for that hearty welcome. It's a small group. This means my jokes are going to fall flat and there's going to be all sorts of problems. Now, you might be asking yourself, could I pick a more tried or banal quote to start this presentation with? And I agree, it's bad. But it somehow captures an enduring truth that seems masked and that most people don't realize. Now, you've learned about what nuclear weapons do, you've learned about nuclear terrorism, but at some point we need to go back to first principles. And I know all of you are reacting to that by, oh God, but we do. And if you don't, as journalists, if you don't understand why we call it the nuclear age, why they called it a nuclear revolution, then you're going to make the same mistakes most policymakers make. And so I want to talk a little bit about how this is really, what's really important here is how we think about the problem. Now, I don't envy you. Reporting on nuclear weapons is a challenging task, not because it's obtuse, complex, and marred by jargon, and it is, but that's the easy part of the hard part. The hard part is trying to think about the problem in a way that requires you to turn the world upside down. So first, you have to do that as a journalist, and then when you figure that out, you have to be able to communicate that to viewers and listeners and readers who don't understand that. And then when you go to your sources and get quotes, many of the military people that you will get quotes from don't understand that because they don't live in a nuclear world. They live in a conventional forces world. How do you get promoted in the military? By fighting wars, by fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have not fought a nuclear war. That's not what most military people are familiar with. So let's go back to the beginning, and that will allow us to talk about escalation and then get into the more fun details of my colleagues. So, two countries have nuclear weapons. Deterrence. Deterrence is, you won't hit me because I can hit you back. And even if you destroy me, I can still hit you back. So there's no point in hitting me in the first place. Because if we do have a war, everyone loses. That's mutual assured destruction. Strategic stability is that when you have the situation, no one is tempted to go first. No one is tempted to try to violate the norms of deterrence. Because you can have conditions, that is to say, instability, where one side might be tempted to go first. Now, how does that happen? Well, maybe one side thinks they can get away with it by going first. They don't believe the fact that even if you're wiped out, you won't be able to respond. One side begins to act in ways, even if they don't have any intention of attacking you, they act as if they are going to attack you, which makes you nervous and makes you want to go first. Or something happens over here, and then suddenly there's a fight, and each side feels compelled to respond to the other, and up the escalatory ladder you go. So deterrence, strategic stability, and instability. Now, again, I say that the hardest thing to do is to wrap your head around how profoundly different this is. For millennia, tribes and empires and states have fought with conventional weapons. All the wars in history have been, other than the use of nuclear weapons once, have been conventional conflicts. And the top tried and tested precepts of those wars are, more is better. It's better to have 100 tanks than 10 tanks. Defense is good. You know, how many of you played Risk before the board game Risk? Well, you know, if you're going to attack another country, you need like 4 times the amount of army men and women, or whatever they are, to attack, because defense is seen as being dominant. You know, it's hard to get over defenses, and there are mountains, and there's swamps. So you need a lot more offensive forces to beat a defensive force. You want to keep your enemy guessing and off balance, and you want to use deception and try to get every advantage you can, and it's a zero-sum game. Anything that your adversary gets is a negative for you. Those are the rules of conventional warfare that have held for millennia. None of that, in my view, is true in the nuclear world. So that's what I mean. You really need to appreciate how the nuclear revolution turns all our normal way of thinking, normal way that applies to wars in Iraq and wars in Afghanistan, wars in Syria, that still applies to conventional wars, does not apply to nuclear wars. Your survival depends on the wisdom of your enemy. So let's take one of those precepts, and one that we heard the president articulate. More is better. My button is bigger than your button. Yes, he said at another point, as long as there are going to be nuclear weapons, we're always going to have more than the other countries. And I think why that doesn't work in the nuclear age is ably summed up by Carl Sagan, who said, imagine a room awash in gasoline There are two implacable enemies in that room. One has 9,000 matches, the other has 7,000. Each of them is concerned about who's ahead and who's stronger. Substitute the word nuclear weapons for matches, and you understand why more is not better. Past losing the first several cities, you've lost. Let's look at another example, defense. Again, defense, a cherished concept in conventional warfare. And I want to set aside the fact that there is no, people talk about missile defense as if it exists. It does not exist for nuclear weapons. It does not exist, but let's pretend it could exist. And let's say this magical defense that you have against nuclear weapons shoots down 90% of all the incoming missiles. Very few things operate in the battlefield at a 90% reliability level, right? But it works at 90%. And let's say they shoot 30 missiles at you and you get 27 out of 30. Of course, the Soviet Union has more than 1,500 strategic weapons, or Soviet Union, Russia has more than 1,500, but we'll call it 30. And we wipe them out. We get 90% of their weapons. We shoot them down. We still lose Los Angeles, New York, and DC. So did you win with that defense? And it's so turned upside down, and people of a certain generation don't even remember that we once had a treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that required that the Soviet Union and the U.S. not build defenses. The treaty outlawed defenses. That's how different the nuclear age is. Now, a lot of people don't like this or are understandably reluctant to go down this path. Deterrence requires that we accept the enemy, Stalin, Mao, Kim Jong-un. And do we really want the adversary to feel secure? Not only accept them, right, as awful as they are, we want them to feel secure. Why? Because no one wins a nuclear war. If they mess up, we still lose. And if we win, we still lose. So what we want is strategic stability. But, I sort of messed up my slide here. But this is where I'm saying, again, that's hard to accept. And while there's a dominant strain in nuclear theory from Brody and Schelling and the earliest thinkers about this, about the absolute weapon, about you can't have defenses, about that it's a revolution, there's a sort of counter strain that never wanted to give up and rely on deterrence, because you have to put your whole population at risk. And people want to feel like, well, if there is a war, I want to win it. I want to help determine the outcome. And some people just can't accept deterrence. And it's an ugly, awful thing, except in a nuclear age, that's what you've got. Now, the alternative deterrence is war fighting. We're going to target our adversaries' missiles. We're going to hit their weapons before they can shoot them off. And we'll have defense. We'll have damage limitation. We'll have missile defenses and civil defense. We'll have tactical nuclear weapons. So we have all sorts of weapons so that we can fight on the battlefield. Now, the problem with that is the more you act like you want to fight a nuclear war, and the more you build forces and have doctrine that look like you are going to engage in war fighting, the more deterrence is weakened. There's a direct trade-off here. You can't have both. Now, we've sort of muddled through by having both functionally in the U.S., but theoretically anyway, the more you strengthen war fighting, the weaker the deterrence, and therefore the more likely you will actually end up fighting a nuclear war. Last slide, I got through in the 10 minutes. So how do you get, I've spent most of my time talking about strategic stability because we can't understand escalation and how this thing falls apart unless you first understand the principles behind what we're trying to achieve. Now, having sort of set out deterrence and strategic stability and all the contradictions and paradoxes inherent in that, let's talk in this last slide about escalation. Then my colleagues will get more specific about areas of the world where escalation is a real danger. Well, how do you get escalation? You can have an escalatory doctrine. You can believe in escalation dominance. That is to say, I believe that if I hit my adversary first, he or she will not respond. That's escalation dominance. I'll take the first move or I'll take the second move. Whatever move I make will be the final move because I know my adversary won't respond. So if you believe that, you're more likely to move up the escalatory ladder. You threaten, as I referred to with counterforce in the last slide, you threaten your enemy's nuclear forces. So, what does the enemy think? They're targeting my nuclear forces. That sure looks like counterforce. That sure looks like my adversary's adversary will want to go first. Decapitation. I hope our North Korea friends talk about that. That's me telling me my time is up. You know, if you keep threatening to take out the political leadership of another country, that makes for an itchy trigger finger. It means there's a risk of misperception that you're doing something, a so-called bloody nose, for example, and your adversary doesn't see it as a limited strike. He thinks he's coming all in for you. And at that point, his incentive is to go first. Putting forces on hair trigger alert. Forward deploying your weapons, so they're right at the border. So if things start to go south, you're risk losing your nuclear weapons or your important military assets, and then you feel compelled to use them, because if you don't use them, you'll lose them. And then there are other reasons why, if something does happen, why you can go up an escalatory ladder as that tit for tat goes up the rungs. You know, you feel compelled to respond for domestic politics. If I don't respond, I'm going to look weak. My population will hate me. Or maybe I don't care about my population. Maybe I'm an authoritarian who just doesn't care, but I don't want to lose face, or I don't want to go down in history as a loser. And lack of constraints on the executive, I can talk about more of that in question and answer. Let me just sort of give you a sense of it. If you're work for Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un has purged and killed many of your colleagues and compatriots, and then General Kim comes up and announces he's going to do something which is a terrible idea, are you going to raise your hand and say, boss, that's a terrible idea? Probably not. That's a permissive environment for mistakes and escalation. And then just poor understanding the adversary, bluffing and bluster, contradictory signaling, poor lines of communication. Where have we ever seen that? So let me stop there. Those are just some general principles and some ways in which you can end up in an escalatory environment, even if you don't want one. And then my colleagues will put meat on the bones by talking about specific examples. Thanks very much.